Sometimes the monsters we fear most are the only ones brave enough to save us. The winter of 1889 gripped Salem, Massachusetts like a vengeful spirit, burying the town under 3 feet of unforgiving snow. In the whitewashed Congregational Church, 17-year-old Evangeline Porter felt the familiar darkness creeping behind her eyes as Reverend Hawthorne's sermon thundered about casting out demons. When her knees buckled and crimson droplets stained her white prayer book, the congregation recoiled in horror, not one soul moving to catch her as she crumpled to the wooden floor. What they didn't know was that Dr. Edmund Porter's devoted daughter harbored a secret that ran deeper than her mysterious blood condition. For weeks, Evangeline had been experiencing vivid dreams of ancient castles and a man with eyes like winter storms, calling to her across centuries. As the townspeople fled, leaving her unconscious form abandoned in the snow-covered churchyard, a figure emerged from the tree line, tall, ethereal, moving with impossible grace through the blizzard. Matthias Blackthorne had walked this earth for a millennium, but never had he felt such urgency to protect a mortal soul. The question that would haunt them both: was he her salvation or her damnation? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The congregation's retreating footsteps crunched through the snow like gunshots in the crystalline air, each sound driving deeper the reality of Evangeline's abandonment. Even Mrs. Whitmore, who had braided ribbons through her hair as a child, gathered her black skirts and hurried away without a backward glance. The heavy oak doors of the church slammed shut with a finality that echoed through the skeletal branches of the surrounding elms. Evangeline lay motionless where they had dragged her, just beyond the consecrated ground of the churchyard, as if her very presence might corrupt the blessed soil. Snowflakes settled on her dark lashes and the curve of her pale cheek, and for a moment she looked like nothing more than a porcelain doll discarded in winter's embrace. But she was not unconscious, not entirely. In that strange twilight between waking and dreaming that had become her torment, Evangeline found herself walking through corridors of black stone, torchlight dancing across tapestries depicting battles between creatures of shadow and light. The dreams had grown stronger each passing week, more vivid than her waking hours. In them, she was never cold, never weak, never collapsing beneath the weight of whatever darkness lived in her blood. Evangeline, the voice that called her name, was not part of the dream this time. It resonated through the winter air with an authority that seemed to make the very snowfall pause in its descent. Her eyelids fluttered, fighting against the lethargy that always followed her spells. Through her half-closed eyes, she glimpsed him. The figure from her dreams stood at the edge of the churchyard, where the manicured cemetery grass gave way to wild forest. He was impossibly tall, dressed in a long black coat that moved like liquid shadow despite the still air. His face was aristocratic, carved from marble and moonlight, with high cheekbones that spoke of centuries rather than years. But it was his eyes that stole her breath, pale blue like winter ice, ancient and knowing, and fixed upon her with an intensity that should have terrified her. Instead, she felt recognition bloom in her chest like warmth spreading through frozen limbs. Matthias. The name whispered through her mind unbidden, as natural as breathing. She had never heard it spoken aloud, yet it felt as familiar as her own heartbeat. In her dreams, he had always remained at a distance, watching from shadow and mist. Now he was here, substantial and real, crossing the snow-covered ground toward her with movements too fluid to be entirely human. Evangeline tried to push herself upright, but her arms trembled with the effort. The metallic taste of blood lingered on her tongue, and she could feel the telltale warmth trickling from her nose, the crimson mark that branded her as cursed in Salem's unforgiving eyes. "Don't be afraid," Matthias said, his voice carrying the refined cadence of old European nobility. He knelt beside her, and she caught the scent of winter pine and something darker, wilder, like the deep forest where civilized things feared to venture. "You're safe now. I know you," she whispered, the words barely audible through lips nearly blue with cold. "From my dreams." Something flickered across his features, surprise, perhaps, or recognition of his own. "Yes," he murmured, reaching out to brush the snow from her hair with fingers that seemed to generate their own warmth. "As I have known you." The touch sent electricity racing through her veins, chasing away the familiar weakness that always followed her episodes. For the first time in months, Evangeline felt truly awake, truly alive. The sensation was both exhilarating and terrifying. "The congregation," she began, struggling to orient herself in reality rather than the strange dreamscape where their connection made sense, "has shown their true nature," Matthias finished, his jaw tightening, as they always do when confronted with what they cannot understand. He slipped one arm beneath her shoulders, supporting her weight effortlessly. "Can you stand?" Evangeline nodded, though she wasn't certain it was true. With his help, she managed to rise to her feet, swaying slightly as the world tilted around her. The church loomed before them, its white clapboard walls stark against the grey sky, every window dark and unwelcoming. "My father," she said suddenly, panic flaring in her chest. "He'll be expecting me home. If I'm not there, when he returns from his rounds." "Dr. Porter will find you safely returned," Matthias assured her. "But first, there are things you must understand, about your condition, about what you are becoming." The words should have sounded mad, the ravings of a stranger who had emerged from the woods like something from Salem's old witch trial testimonies. Instead, they resonated with a truth that Evangeline had been afraid to acknowledge, that whatever was happening to her was beyond the reach of her father's medical expertise or the congregation's fervent prayers. "What am I becoming?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer would change everything. Matthias's pale eyes held hers, ancient sorrow and infinite patience warring in their depths. "Something magnificent," he whispered, "and something damned." The warmth of his touch lingered, even after Matthias released her, a phantom heat that seemed to spread through Evangeline's entire being. She stood in the empty churchyard, watching his dark figure retreat into the shadows between the trees, until only the whisper of wind through bare branches remained. When she finally turned toward home, her legs felt steadier than they had in weeks. The Porter house stood on Elm Street like a beacon of respectability, white clapboards pristine despite the harsh winter, black shutters perfectly aligned, the brass nameplate beside the front door polished to mirror brightness. It was the home of Salem's most trusted physician, a man whose reputation for both medical skill and moral character had been built over 2 decades of faithful service to the community. Evangeline slipped through the back entrance, grateful that her father remained on his rounds. The kitchen held the lingering warmth of the morning's fire, though the embers had long since died to ash. She moved through the familiar routine of domesticity, stoking the stove, setting the kettle to boil, arranging the delicate china cups her mother had brought from Boston as a bride. These were the rituals that defined her days, the careful choreography of a proper young lady awaiting a suitable marriage proposal. Yet today, her hands trembled as she measured the tea leaves. Matthias's words echoed through her mind. Something magnificent. Something damned. The front door opened with its familiar creak, followed by the measured footsteps of Dr. Josiah Porter. Evangeline hastily checked her reflection in the window glass, relieved to see that the blood had been wiped clean from her face and her color had returned to something approaching normal. "Evangeline?" Her father's voice carried the same gentle authority that had comforted countless patients through their darkest hours. "How was service this morning?" She emerged from the kitchen carrying the tea service, her smile practiced and serene. "Quite moving, Papa." Reverend Blackwood spoke on the necessity of faith during trials. Dr. Porter settled into his favorite chair beside the fireplace, his medical bag resting at his feet like a faithful hound. At 53, he possessed the kind of distinguished bearing that inspired immediate confidence, silver threading his dark hair, intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, hands that remained steady whether delivering a child or setting a broken bone. He was everything Salem valued in a man, learned, devout, unwaveringly moral. "I'm pleased to hear it," he said. accepting his cup with the same careful attention he brought to everything. "Mrs. Whitmore stopped by the Hendersons' farm while I was attending to young Timothy's fever. She mentioned you seemed pale during the service." Evangeline's heart lurched, but she kept her expression neutral. Perhaps the church was overly warm. You know how close the air becomes when the congregation is full. It was a careful lie, one that relied on her father's absence from the morning service due to his emergency call to the Hendersons. Dr. Porter nodded thoughtfully, though his sharp eyes studied her face with clinical precision. "You've been having the dizzy spells again," he said. It wasn't a question. "The iron tonic isn't helping as much as we'd hoped." "I feel perfectly well now," she insisted, settling into the chair opposite him. This was her world. Quiet afternoons discussing medical treatments and social obligations, the predictable rhythm of a life circumscribed by propriety and expectation. Her father loved her with fierce protectiveness, and she was the center of his universe since her mother's death 5 years prior. She was his assistant in small medical matters, his hostess when the church elders came to dinner, his pride and his greatest concern. Dr. Hammond mentioned a new treatment being used in Boston hospitals. Her father continued. "A sanatorium approach that has shown remarkable success with nervous disorders in young women. Perhaps a change of environment." "Papa, no." The words escaped before she could stop them, sharp with an anxiety she couldn't explain. The thought of leaving Salem, of being sent away like some fragile creature requiring institutional care, sent panic racing through her veins. But beneath that fear lay something else. A strange certainty that she belonged here, that something important was about to begin. Dr. Porter's eyebrows rose at her vehemence. "I only want what's best for you, my dear. These episodes are becoming more frequent, more severe. If word spreads that my own daughter suffers from some condition I cannot cure..." He didn't need to finish. In Salem, reputation was currency, and scandal could destroy a lifetime of careful cultivation. Yet Evangeline found herself thinking not of social consequences but of pale blue eyes and a voice that spoke her name like a prayer. "I won't be sent away," she said quietly. "Whatever is wrong with me, whatever I'm becoming." The words slipped out before she could call them back. "Becoming." Her father leaned forward, his medical instincts sharpening. "Evangeline, what a curious choice of words." She forced another smile, though it felt brittle as winter ice. "I only meant that I'm growing stronger each day. These spells will pass." Even as she spoke the reassurance, she knew it was false. Something was changing inside her, something that had nothing to do with nervous disorders or iron deficiencies. And for the first time in her carefully ordered life, the prospect of change didn't terrify her. It thrilled her. Dr. Porter studied her for a long moment, his physician's instincts clearly troubled by something he couldn't quite identify. Before he could press further, a sharp rap at the front door interrupted the afternoon's quiet. The sound carried an urgency that made them both straighten. In Salem, unexpected visitors rarely brought pleasant news. "I'll see who it is," Evangeline murmured, grateful for the reprieve. But as she rose from her chair, her father's hand caught her wrist. "Wait." His voice carried a note she'd never heard before, something between fear and protectiveness. "Let me answer it." The knocking came again, more insistent this time, followed by a woman's voice calling through the door. "Dr. Porter! Please, sir, you must come at once." Evangeline recognized the speaker as Mrs. Gideon, wife of the blacksmith, her usually composed demeanor shattered by whatever crisis had driven her through the snow to their door. Dr. Porter released Evangeline's wrist and strode to the entrance, his medical bag already in hand with the practiced efficiency of 20 years responding to emergencies. Mrs. Gideon stood on their threshold, her face flushed from cold and exertion, her bonnet askew. "Doctor, it's my youngest, Sarah. She's taken with the same fits as..." Her eyes darted to Evangeline, and her words died in her throat. "The same fits as what?" Dr. Porter pressed gently. "As Miss Evangeline," Mrs. Gideon whispered, as if speaking the words aloud might summon some terrible curse. Sarah collapsed during her afternoon lessons. blood from her nose, her eyes rolling back, speaking in tongues that ain't Christian. "And Doctor," her voice dropped even lower, "she's asking for your daughter by name, crying for Evangeline like her heart's breaking." The teacup slipped from Evangeline's nerveless fingers, shattering against the hardwood floor in a cascade of porcelain and steaming liquid. The sound seemed to echo through the house like a gunshot, but she barely noticed. Sarah Gideon was only 14, a sweet-faced girl who helped her mother with the washing and sang hymns in the church choir. There was no reason for her to know Evangeline beyond polite greetings after Sunday service. No earthly reason. "I'll come immediately," Dr. Porter said, already reaching for his coat. "Evangeline, stay here. Rest. I'll return as soon as—" No. The word came out stronger than she'd intended, carrying an authority that surprised them all. "If Sarah is asking for me, then I should come. Absolutely not." Her father's tone brooked no argument. "Whatever is affecting the Gideon girl, I won't risk exposing you to—" "To what, Papa?" Evangeline stepped closer, glass crunching beneath her boots. "To whatever I already have. To whatever I am." The questions hung in the air like accusation and revelation combined. Mrs. Gideon's eyes widened, and she made a hasty sign of the cross. "Begging your pardon, miss, but perhaps it would be best if you stayed away. The townsfolk are already talking, saying that what you carry might be—" She couldn't bring herself to finish. "Contagious," Evangeline supplied. "Or cursed." The silence that followed confirmed her worst fears. Salem's whispers had already begun, the same poison that had condemned women to the gallows 2 centuries before. Her collapse at church hadn't been seen as a medical emergency. It had been interpreted as something far more sinister. Through the front window, she caught sight of movement in the street. Small clusters of people hurried past, their faces grim with purpose and fear. Word was spreading through Salem like wildfire, and she could read the truth in their expressions. 2 young women struck by the same mysterious affliction could only mean one thing. Witchcraft had returned to Salem. "They think I'm a witch," she said quietly, the words falling into the room like stones into still water. "Nonsense," Dr. Porter said firmly, but his hands shook as he buttoned his coat. "You suffer from a medical condition, nothing more. Once I examine the Gideon girl, I'll find a rational explanation for—" A scream pierced the afternoon air, high and agonized, carrying clearly through the winter stillness. It came from the direction of the blacksmith's shop, where the Gideon family lived in the rooms above their work. The sound raised every instinct of terror that Salem's history had bred into its people. Mrs. Gideon sobbed. "Please, doctor, she's dying." Evangeline made her choice in that instant, stepping past her father toward the door. "I'm coming with you, Evangeline. She's calling for me, Papa." She met his eyes, seeing her own fear reflected there, but also something else. A desperate hope that his medical training could explain away what was happening to his daughter. "If there's any chance I can help her, any chance that what's happening to both of us can be understood rather than feared, then I have to try." Dr. Porter stared at her for a moment that stretched like eternity. In his face, she saw the collision of everything he believed: his faith in science, his love for her, his terror of losing the only family he had left. Finally, he nodded. "Stay close to me. Whatever happens, don't leave my side." As they stepped into the cold afternoon, Evangeline felt the weight of Salem's eyes upon them, and the terrible certainty that nothing would ever be the same. The walk to the Gideon house felt like a march to the gallows. With each step through Salem's snow-covered streets, Evangeline became increasingly aware of the curtains twitching in windows, the conversations that died abruptly as they passed, the way even their closest neighbors found urgent business that required them to hurry in the opposite direction. The weight of their scrutiny pressed against her shoulders like a physical burden. "What am I doing?" The thought hammered against her skull with each footfall. "Papa is right. I should have stayed home, should have let him handle this alone." But even as doubt consumed her, Sarah Gideon's agonized screams continued to pierce the afternoon air, and with each cry, Evangeline felt something deep within her chest respond. A pull as inexorable as gravity, as if some invisible thread connected her to the suffering girl. "Perhaps we should reconsider," Dr. Porter murmured, his medical bag clutched white-knuckled in his hand. "If the townspeople believe there's some connection between your condition and Sarah's, then they'll believe it whether I'm there or not," Evangeline finished, though her voice trembled with uncertainty. She pulled her woolen cloak tighter around her shoulders, trying to ward off a chill that had nothing to do with winter's bite. "At least this way, we might find answers. Or damn ourselves completely," her mind whispered treacherously. The blacksmith's shop loomed before them, its usually cheerful windows dark and foreboding. A small crowd had gathered in the street, goodwives clutching their prayer books, men with the hard faces of those preparing for battle against an unknown enemy. Evangeline recognized most of them: Mrs. Whitmore, who had taught her to embroider, Samuel Hayes, who delivered their firewood each autumn, the Corey twins, who had attended the same dame's school where she'd learned her letters. Now they looked at her as if she were a stranger. No, worse than a stranger. They looked at her as if she were dangerous. "There she is," someone whispered, the words carrying clearly in the cold air. "The Porter girl, come to help her sister in darkness." Sister in darkness. The phrase sent ice through Evangeline's veins. In Salem's collective memory, such words carried the weight of rope and flame, of accusations that destroyed entire families. She found herself wondering if this was how it had felt for the accused in 1692, this horrible certainty that no protestation of innocence would matter, that guilt had already been decided by whispers and superstition. "Ignore them," her father said quietly, but she could hear the strain in his voice. His reputation, built over decades of faithful service, was crumbling with every step they took toward the Gideon house. By associating himself with whatever was happening to her, he was risking everything he'd worked to build. "I'm destroying him," she realized with sickening clarity. "Papa's sacrificing his standing in the community for me, and I'm letting him do it." The rational thing, the selfless thing, would be to turn around, return home, and let him handle this crisis alone. She could claim sudden illness, feminine delicacy, any number of acceptable excuses that Salem society would understand. In a week, perhaps 2, the talk would die down. Her father's reputation might recover. Life could return to its careful patterns of propriety and predictability. But as another scream echoed from the rooms above the blacksmith's shop, Evangeline felt that strange pull intensify. Whatever was happening to Sarah Gideon, it was connected to her own episodes. She was certain of it now with a certainty that transcended logic, and if there was even the smallest chance she could help, could ease the girl's suffering. "Dr. Porter." A man emerged from the crowd, Jonas Whitmore, whose stern features reflected the same suspicion Evangeline had seen in his wife's face at church. "Perhaps it would be wise for your daughter to wait outside, given the circumstances." "My daughter is here as my assistant," Dr. Porter replied with admirable steadiness. "Her presence may be medically necessary." "Medically necessary?" Mrs. Corey stepped forward, her prayer book pressed against her chest like armor. "Or is there some other necessity at work here? Some communion between the afflicted?" The word communion hung in the air, like an accusation. Evangeline felt the crowd's attention focus on her with laser intensity, studying her face for signs of guilt, of otherworldly influence, of whatever dark force they believed she carried. "They're right to fear me," she thought suddenly, remembering Matthias's words, something magnificent, something damned. Whatever was changing within her, whatever she was becoming, it was beyond the boundaries of Salem's understanding. Perhaps it was beyond the boundaries of God's grace entirely. The doubt struck her like a physical blow. What if her father's faith in science was misplaced? What if the congregation's accusations held more truth than she wanted to acknowledge? What if, in trying to help Sarah Gideon, she was actually spreading some supernatural contagion that would destroy everything she held dear? Another scream split the air, weaker this time, fading into a broken sob that spoke of a young girl's terror and pain. Evangeline straightened her spine and walked toward the blacksmith's door, doubt and determination warring in her heart with every step. The heavy wooden door of the blacksmith's shop swung open at Dr. Porter's knock, revealing Thomas Gideon's haggard face. The burly man who could bend iron to his will now looked utterly broken, his leather apron stained with tears and his massive hands trembling. "Doctor, thank the Lord," he gasped, stepping aside to let them enter. "She's upstairs and we don't know what to do. My Sarah, she's not herself." The workshop was dim and cold, the forge long since gone dark. Tools hung from their pegs like silent witnesses, and the smell of coal dust and metal shavings couldn't quite mask something else, something sweet and metallic that made Evangeline's stomach clench with recognition. It was the same scent she'd noticed during her own episodes, though she'd never understood what it meant. Blood, her mind supplied with crystalline clarity. "It's the smell of blood." They climbed the narrow stairs to the family's living quarters, each step accompanied by increasingly desperate sobs from above. Mrs. Gideon met them at the landing, her face ravaged by tears and terror. "She keeps asking for you, Miss Porter," she whispered, clutching Evangeline's sleeve with desperate fingers. "Over and over, crying your name like you're the only one who can save her. But how could she know? She barely speaks to anyone outside the family." Evangeline had no answer. Sarah Gideon was a quiet, modest girl who attended church faithfully and helped her mother with household duties. They'd exchanged perhaps a dozen words in their entire acquaintance. Polite greetings, nothing more. There was no earthly reason for the girl to call for her in distress. No earthly reason, her thoughts echoed, and she shivered. Dr. Porter moved ahead into the small bedroom, his medical training overriding any personal fears. Evangeline followed, then stopped dead at what she saw. Sarah Gideon lay writhing on her narrow bed, her nightgown soaked with perspiration and something darker. Blood trickled from her nose in a steady stream, staining the white fabric crimson. Her eyes had rolled back, showing only the whites, and her body convulsed with a violence that seemed impossible for someone so small and delicate. But it was the words tumbling from her lips that turned Evangeline's blood to ice water. "She comes," Sarah gasped between convulsions. "She comes across the threshold. The one who bridges, the one who chooses. Evangeline, Evangeline, where are you?" The darkness calls. The blood sings. The old king waits. "Sarah!" Mrs. Gideon rushed to her daughter's side, trying to still the girl's thrashing limbs. "Sweet child, wake up!" Dr. Porter was already opening his medical bag, reaching for instruments that Evangeline knew would be useless against this. This wasn't medicine's domain. It belonged to something far older and more terrifying. "The blood sings," Sarah whispered again, her sightless eyes turning toward Evangeline with impossible accuracy. "Can you hear it, sister? Can you hear how it calls us home?" Sister. The word hit Evangeline like a physical blow. Not the casual endearment of friendship, but something deeper, recognition, kinship, an acknowledgement of shared fate. "This is my fault." The realization crashed over her with devastating certainty. Whatever's happening to her, I've caused it somehow. My presence in Salem, my episodes, my very existence, it's spreading like a contagion. She should run. Every instinct screamed at her to flee this room, this house, perhaps Salem itself. She could claim overwhelming distress, feminine vapors, anything that would let her escape before she made this worse. But Sarah's agonized whispers continued, and Evangeline found herself stepping closer to the bed instead of toward the door. "What did you call me?" she asked softly. Sarah's convulsions stilled for a moment, and her eyes, somehow clear now despite their rolled-back whites, fixed on Evangeline's face. "Sister," the girl breathed. "Blood sister." The awakening begins, the threshold opens, and we must choose. Light or darkness, salvation or damnation. He waits in the shadows, the pale king who remembers our names. "Will you answer when he calls?" "Evangeline, step back," Dr. Porter commanded, but his voice seemed to come from very far away. Because Sarah was right. Evangeline could hear it now. A sound beneath sound, a rhythm that matched her own heartbeat but felt ancient beyond measure. The blood singing in her veins, calling her towards something she didn't understand but couldn't resist. She reached out her hand toward Sarah's outstretched fingers. "Evangeline, no!" her father shouted. But it was too late. The moment their skin touched, the world exploded into sensation. Images flooded her mind. Snow-covered woods, pale blue eyes, a figure moving through darkness with predatory grace. She saw herself as if from above, standing at a crossroads between two worlds, while something magnificent and terrible waited for her decision. When the vision faded, she was no longer Dr. Porter's sheltered daughter seeking to help a suffering neighbor. She was something else entirely, and there was no going back. The visions crashed through Evangeline's consciousness like breaking waves, each one more vivid and impossible than the last. She saw Salem from impossible heights, not as the familiar collection of houses and shops she'd known all her life, but as a pattern of light and shadow, with thin silver threads connecting certain buildings like a spider's web. Some threads pulsed with warm golden light, others with cold blue radiance that reminded her unsettlingly of winter starlight. Sarah's hand in hers was burning cold, and through that contact came whispers in languages that predated English, predated Latin, predated anything human tongues had ever shaped. Yet somehow, impossibly, she understood every word. The bloodline awakens, the compact stirs, the guardians must choose. Evangeline! Her father's voice seemed to come from another world entirely. Release her hand, now! But she couldn't. The visions were showing her things she needed to understand, Salem's true history, the real reason the witch trials had ended so abruptly, the ancient agreements that bound certain families to something far older than Puritan faith. She saw herself in Sarah's memories, not as they'd met in life, but as figures that had walked these same paths in different times, different faces, always connected by the silver threads that bound them to. The bedroom door burst open with such violence that it slammed against the wall, jolting Evangeline back to the present. She released Sarah's hand and spun around to find 3 men filling the doorway. Jonas Whitmore, Samuel Hayes, and behind them, the tall, grim figure of Pastor Aldrich. "Step away from the girl, Miss Porter." Pastor Aldrich's voice carried the authority of divine mandate. "Whatever unholy communion you're attempting ends now." Pastor Aldrich. Dr. Porter stepped protectively in front of Evangeline, his medical bag clutched like a shield. "My daughter is here as my assistant. She's done nothing. Nothing." The pastor's dark eyes fixed on Evangeline with the intensity of a hawk studying prey. Mrs. Whitmore observed from the window. She saw the moment these two touched. The Gideon girl's convulsions stopped immediately, did they not? Evangeline's heart hammered against her ribs as she realized the terrible truth. Sarah's thrashing had indeed ceased the moment their hands connected. The girl now lay peacefully on her bed, her breathing steady, the blood flow from her nose stemmed. To medical eyes, it might appear that Evangeline had somehow helped her. But to Salem's ever-watchful guardians of spiritual purity, it looked like something far more damning. "The Lord's work," Pastor Aldrich continued, his voice growing harder with each word, "does not require the touch of one afflicted to heal another. Only darker powers work through such intimate contact between the cursed." "Cursed!" Mrs. Gideon looked between Evangeline and her now peaceful daughter with dawning horror. "You think my Sarah is cursed?" "I think, dear woman, that your daughter was the unfortunate victim of spiritual contagion, and that the source stands before us now." The pastor's gaze never wavered from Evangeline's face. "Tell me, child, what did you see when you touched the Gideon girl? What visions filled your mind?" The honest answer would damn her completely. Evangeline could still feel echoes of those impossible sights, the silver threads, the ancient compacts, the sense of being part of something vast and supernatural that existed parallel to Salem's daylight world. To speak of such things would confirm every suspicion, validate every whisper. But as she opened her mouth to lie, to claim she'd seen nothing, Sarah Gideon stirred on her bed and spoke with perfect, terrifying clarity. "The Pale King sends his regards, Evangeline. He says the time for hiding is ending." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the winter wind seemed to hold its breath. Pastor Aldrich drew himself up to his full impressive height. "I've heard enough. Jonas, Samuel, escort Miss Porter to the church. We'll hold vigil over her tonight and pray for God's guidance in determining the proper course of action." "No." Dr. Porter moved to block their path, his usually gentle demeanor transforming into something fierce and protective. "I won't allow you to subject my daughter to your medieval superstitions. If you have accusations to make, present evidence. If you have concerns about her health, defer to medical expertise. But I will not permit you to treat her as some common witch." Pastor Aldrich supplied the word Dr. Porter couldn't bring himself to speak. "Because that, dear doctor, is precisely what we're discussing. Your daughter carries a spiritual infection that spreads through contact, manifests through prophetic utterances, and appears to operate under the guidance of what young Sarah called a pale king. If that doesn't constitute witchcraft, then Salem learned nothing from its previous tribulations." Through the window, Evangeline could see more figures gathering in the street below. Half the town, it seemed, drawn by word of new supernatural manifestations. Their faces reflected the same terrible certainty she'd seen 200 years before in books and paintings, the absolute conviction that evil walked among them, and that only swift, decisive action could preserve their souls. She was no longer Dr. Porter's beloved daughter. She was Salem's next witch. The crowd below had grown larger in the span of minutes, their voices carrying up through the winter air, like the distant howl of hunting wolves. Evangeline pressed herself against the small bedroom's wall, her mind racing through possibilities that all led to the same terrifying conclusion. There would be no reasoning with Salem once its collective fear took hold. "Papa," she whispered, catching her father's sleeve as he continued his heated exchange with Pastor Aldrich. "We need to leave. Now." Dr. Porter's jaw tightened, but he didn't break eye contact with the pastor. "My daughter and I will depart when our medical consultation is complete, not before." "Your medical consultation?" Jonas Whitmore stepped forward, his weathered face twisted with righteous anger. "Doctor, your daughter touched that girl and spoke with whatever demon possesses her. This isn't medicine, it's witchcraft, plain and simple." From her bed, Sarah Gideon laughed, a sound like silver bells wrapped in shadow. "Demon? Oh, Goodman Whitmore, you understand so little. We're not possessed, we're awakening." Mrs. Gideon sobbed and pressed her hands over her ears, as if she could block out her daughter's words. Thomas Gideon stood frozen by the window, his massive frame trembling as he watched his neighbors gather below with the purposeful movements of a mob taking shape. "Thomas," Pastor Aldrich said, his tone gentling slightly, "you know what must be done. Salem has faced this evil before. We know how to cleanse it from our midst. Cleanse it." The euphemism made Evangeline's stomach turn. She'd read the accounts, studied the testimonies from 1692. Salem's method of cleansing had involved rope and stones, fire and crushing weight. The thought of her father caught in such madness, of him suffering for her sake, made her chest constrict with panic. "I won't let them hurt you," she said quietly, reaching for his hand. "Evangeline." "No." Dr. Porter pulled away from her touch, and the rejection hit her like a physical blow. Don't touch anyone else. Not until we understand what's happening." The words weren't meant as condemnation, but they landed like one anyway. Even her father, who had defended her, protected her, risked his reputation for her, was beginning to fear what she might be becoming. And perhaps he was right to fear it. The visions Sarah had shared still pulsed through her memory. Silver threads connecting certain houses, ancient agreements written in blood and starlight, the sense of being part of something vast and hungry that existed just beyond Salem's understanding. She could feel it now, that presence watching from the shadows, waiting for her to make a choice that would change everything. "The pale king sends his regards." Sarah's words echoed in her mind, and with them came an image so vivid it might have been memory, a figure moving through snow-laden woods with inhuman grace, pale eyes fixed on Salem's lights with predatory interest. He was coming. She knew it with bone-deep certainty, though she couldn't explain how or why. Whatever force was awakening within her, Whatever change was spreading through Salem's young women, it was drawing his attention like a beacon in the darkness. "The situation is quite simple," Pastor Aldrich announced, his voice cutting through the charged atmosphere. "Miss Porter will submit herself to spiritual examination, during which we'll determine the nature of her affliction and the appropriate remedy. Dr. Porter, you may observe the proceedings, but you will not interfere. Spiritual examination." Her father's voice dripped with contempt. "You mean interrogation, torture, if history is any guide." "I mean salvation," the pastor replied coldly. "For your daughter's soul and for this community's safety." Through the window, Evangeline could see more lanterns bobbing in the street as additional townspeople arrived. The crowd was taking on the organized quality of a militia muster, with men positioning themselves at key points around the building. They weren't just angry, they were preparing for siege. "They think I might try to escape," she realized with growing dread. "They think I'm powerful enough to be dangerous." The terrible irony was that they might be right. She could feel something stirring within her, responding to their fear and hostility with its own dark hunger. The careful control she'd maintained over her episodes was beginning to fray, and she wasn't certain what might happen if it snapped entirely. "Sarah," she said suddenly, turning toward the girl who had started this cascade of revelation. "What happens now? What does he want from us?" Sarah's eyes, fully focused now, no longer showing their disturbing whites, met hers with ancient knowledge that belonged on no 17-year-old face. "He wants us to choose," she whispered, "between the light that burns and the darkness that embraces, between the life that restricts and the death that liberates." Her voice dropped to barely audible, between staying human and becoming something magnificent. Pastor Aldrich's face went white with fury. "Enough, Jonas, Samuel, take her. We end this blasphemy now." As the men moved toward her, Evangeline felt her control finally shatter. Power surged through her veins like liquid fire, and somewhere in the distance she heard the sound of approaching footsteps in the snow. The Pale King was coming to collect what was his. The moment Jonas Whitmore's calloused hand closed around her arm, Evangeline's world exploded into sensation. Power erupted from her core like a dam bursting, racing through her veins with such intensity that she gasped aloud. The bedroom's oil lamp flickered wildly, casting dancing shadows that seemed to writhe with malevolent life. "Release me," she whispered, but her voice carried a resonance that belonged to no 17-year-old girl. Jonas jerked his hand back as if burned, staring at his palm where angry red welts were already forming in the exact shape of her fingers. Samuel Hayes took an involuntary step backward, his face pale with sudden understanding that they were no longer dealing with Dr. Porter's sheltered daughter. "What in God's name?" Pastor Aldrich began. "God?" Sarah Gideon's laughter cut through his words like broken glass. "Oh, Pastor, God abandoned Salem long before tonight. We serve older masters now." The power coursing through Evangeline's body was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. She could sense every heartbeat in the room, smell the copper tang of fear in their perspiration, feel the silver threads that connected her to something vast and hungry, waiting in the winter darkness beyond Salem's borders. This was what she'd been fighting against during every episode, every fainting spell, not weakness, but strength too dangerous for mortal flesh to contain. Through the window came the sound she'd been dreading and anticipating, footsteps crunching through snow with predatory precision. Not the hurried gait of townspeople rushing to witness the spectacle, but the measured pace of something that had all the time in the world, and no fear of mortal resistance. "He's here," she realized, her heart hammering against her ribs. "He's actually here." "Papa," she said urgently, reaching toward her father with hands that now seemed to glow with inner light. "You need to leave. All of you need to leave before." The footsteps stopped directly below the window. Pastor Aldrich moved to peer outside, then stumbled backward with a strangled cry. "Impossible. There's no one there, but I can see." His voice trailed off into horrified whisper. "Footprints, in the snow, leading right to our door." The temperature in the small bedroom plummeted so rapidly that their breath began forming visible clouds. Frost spread across the window glass in delicate, beautiful patterns that hurt to look at directly. Downstairs, something knocked against the front door, not the urgent pounding of frightened neighbors, but 3 deliberate raps that seemed to shake the entire house. "Don't answer it," Dr. Porter said, his medical rationality finally cracking under the weight of impossible events. "Whatever's happening here, whatever my daughter has become, we don't invite that thing inside." But Mrs. Gideon was already moving toward the stairs, her face slack with the same terrible recognition that had transformed Sarah's features. "He's come for them," she murmured. "The Pale King has come to claim his brides." "Martha, no!" Thomas Gideon lunged after his wife, but she moved with supernatural speed, descending the stairs before anyone could stop her. From below came the sound of the front door opening, followed by Martha Gideon's voice speaking words in a language that predated human civilization. The responding voice was male, cultured, and carried an accent that belonged to no nation Evangeline had ever studied. "My dear woman, how kind of you to welcome me. I've come for what is mine." Sarah sat up on her bed, her movements fluid as water, her eyes now completely black from corner to corner. "He's magnificent," she breathed. "Can you feel his power, Evangeline? Can you sense what we might become?" Evangeline could feel it. Ancient, beyond measure, patient as stone, and utterly without mercy for anything that stood between it and its desires. This was the presence she'd sensed watching Salem from the shadows, the force that had been drawing her toward this moment through every fainting spell, every episode her father had attributed to mere blood weakness. Her blood weakness wasn't an illness, it was inheritance. "We have to run," she said desperately, turning toward the window that overlooked the Gideons' small garden. "Papa, the window. We can climb down." "Too late," Pastor Aldrich whispered, his face gray with defeat. "Listen." Footsteps were ascending the stairs now, accompanied by Martha Gideon's continued chanting. But there was something else, other voices joining hers from throughout the house, throughout the neighborhood. The awakening wasn't limited to Sarah. Whatever power was stirring in Salem's young women was responding to their master's call, spreading like wildfire through bloodlines that had carried this potential for generations. Dr. Porter grabbed his medical bag with shaking hands, as if earthly instruments could somehow protect them from what approached. "Evangeline, whatever happens, remember that you are my daughter. You are good. You are human." But even as he spoke the words, she could feel her humanity slipping away like water through her fingers. The power thrumming through her veins demanded acknowledgement, demanded choice, demanded she finally accept what she had always been meant to become. The footsteps reached the landing. 3 knocks echoed against the bedroom door. "May I enter, dear ones? We have so very much to discuss." The voice that spoke through the door was everything Evangeline had feared, and everything she had unconsciously yearned for. Velvet over steel, ancient authority wrapped in perfect courtesy. When no one answered, the door simply opened, its hinges moving without sound despite having creaked mere minutes before. The man who entered should not have been able to fit his presence in such a small space. Tall beyond mortal proportion, pale as moonlight on snow, he wore darkness like other men wore fine coats. His eyes found Evangeline immediately, and she felt herself falling into depths that held centuries of winter nights. "Matthias Blackthorne," Pastor Aldrich whispered, and Evangeline was startled to hear recognition in the pastor's voice. "I should have known. The Blackthorne name appears in our oldest church records, always connected to irregularities. Pastor Aldrich." The Pale King inclined his head with mocking courtesy. "Still shepherding Salem's flock toward salvation, I see. How admirably futile." His gaze swept the room, cataloguing each terrified face before settling on Dr. Porter. "And the good doctor. Your reputation for healing precedes you, though I fear tonight you'll discover some conditions require different remedies." Dr. Porter stepped protectively in front of Evangeline, his medical bag raised like a pathetic shield. "I don't know what you are, but my daughter is under my protection. She's done nothing to deserve whatever you're planning. Matthias's laughter was like ice cracking on a frozen lake. Protection? Dear doctor, you cannot protect her from what she already is. His pale eyes found Evangeline over her father's shoulder. Can you, my dear? Tell them what you felt when you touched young Sarah. Tell them what you see when you look at me. The honest answer died in Evangeline's throat, because what she saw was not a monster but a revelation. Power called to power, and every cell in her body recognized its master. The fainting spells, the blood weakness, the episodes that had plagued her since childhood, they had all been preparation for this moment, her human flesh gradually adapting to accommodate something far more potent than mortal blood. I see death, she whispered. But even as she spoke the words, she knew they weren't true. Death was an ending. What she saw in Matthias Blackthorne was transformation without limit. Liar, Sarah breathed from her bed, her voice rich with newfound power. You see freedom. You see choice. You see everything Salem has denied you since birth. Pastor Aldrich pulled a silver cross from his coat, holding it between them and Matthias like a talisman. In the name of Christ, I command you to... The cross simply crumbled to dust in his hands. How tedious, Matthias murmured. Salem's spiritual guardians never learn. Your faith has power, Pastor, but only over those who choose to be bound by it. His attention returned to Evangeline. The question now is one of allegiance. Will you continue pretending to be your father's sheltered daughter, or will you embrace what your blood has always known itself to be? Don't listen to him, Dr. Porter pleaded, turning to face her with desperate love in his eyes. Evangeline, you are human. You are good. You are my daughter, and I will not let this creature corrupt what is pure in you. The words, meant as salvation, felt like chains. Every human, every good, every reminder of her supposed purity was another bar in a cage she had been building around herself since childhood. She looked at her father, this man who had loved her, protected her, sacrificed for her, and felt the terrible weight of disappointing him settling on her shoulders like lead. I know what I am, Papa, she said softly, and watched his face crumple as he heard the truth in her voice. I've always known. The episodes, the fainting. I wasn't fighting illness. I was fighting awakening. No. Dr. Porter dropped his medical bag, its contents spilling across the floor in a clatter of useless instruments. No, I won't accept that. There has to be treatment, has to be some way to... Cure her? Matthias stepped closer, and Evangeline could smell winter air and old magic on his coat. Doctor, you might as well attempt to cure the moon of its need to rise. What your daughter possesses is not ailment but inheritance. Through the window, Evangeline could see the crowd below growing restless. Torches had appeared among the lanterns, and she caught glimpses of rope, of stones, of all the tools Salem had once used to cleanse itself of supernatural taint. They were preparing for an execution, and her father would die alongside her for the crime of loving what he should have abandoned. The realization struck her with paralyzing clarity. There was no escape that preserved both their lives. No choice that saved her father's love and her own existence. Salem would have its purge, and everything she had ever cherished would burn. But as despair threatened to crush her entirely, another realization blazed through Evangeline's consciousness, with the force of lightning splitting darkness. The power coursing through her veins wasn't just supernatural strength, it was choice. For the first time in her 17 years, she possessed the ability to determine her own fate rather than merely endure what others decided for her. You're wrong, she said, her voice growing stronger as understanding crystallized. All of you. Matthias raised an elegant eyebrow, genuine curiosity flickering across his ancient features. Even he hadn't expected this. Papa, you speak of curing what I am, as if my nature is disease. She stepped away from her father's protective stance, feeling the floorboards steady beneath her feet for the first time in years. Pastor Aldrich, you prepare to cleanse what you call evil, never questioning whether your definition of evil serves justice or merely fear. Her gaze swept to Sarah, still radiating that terrible dark joy. And you, Sarah, You speak of magnificent transformation, as if abandoning humanity is the only path to power. The room had gone utterly silent. Outside, even the mob's restless murmuring seemed to pause, as if all of Salem held its breath. But none of you understand the actual choice before me, Evangeline continued, her voice carrying a resonance that made the frost-covered windows vibrate. You see only extremes, human or monster, salvation or damnation, submission or rebellion. You cannot conceive of something between, something unprecedented. Matthias moved closer, his pale eyes intent with something that might have been hope or hunger. And what do you see, my dear? I see a bridge. The words emerged from depths of certainty she hadn't known she possessed. My blood carries both mortal compassion and immortal strength. My heart beats with human love and supernatural will. I am not choosing between two natures. I am both natures, and that makes me something Salem has never faced before. Dr. Porter's face crumpled with confusion and desperate love. I don't understand what you're saying. I know, Papa, and that's precisely why I have to leave Salem, not to become Matthias's creature, not to burn on Pastor Aldrich's pyre, but to discover what I am when I'm not forced to be only what others expect. She turned toward Matthias, meeting those ancient eyes without flinching. You want to claim me as your inheritor, your dark bride awakening to power. But I am not merely awakening. I am choosing what to awaken into, and I choose to retain my capacity for love alongside my supernatural strength. Impossible, Pastor Aldrich whispered. Darkness cannot coexist with light. Can't it? Evangeline felt power flowing through her, but now it was power tempered by will rather than consuming it. I loved my father before I understood my heritage. That love doesn't vanish because I've gained the ability to crush stone with my bare hands. I grieve for Salem's fear, even as I reject its limitations. I can honor what was human in me while embracing what is eternal. Sarah sat up straighter on her bed, her black eyes reflecting something almost like uncertainty. The power demands sacrifice. It always has. You cannot serve two masters. I serve no master but my own conscience, Evangeline replied firmly. The power is mine to direct, not the reverse. Matthias studied her with the intensity of a scholar examining a text in an unknown language. You propose to walk between worlds without belonging fully to either. Do you understand how dangerous such a path would be? How lonely? More lonely than pretending to be only human while power tears me apart from within. More dangerous than surrendering my will to ancient hungers I don't understand. Evangeline shook her head. I've been lonely and in danger my entire life, Matthias Blackthorne. At least now I'll face those challenges on my own terms. The temperature in the room began to normalize as if responding to her newfound equilibrium. The frost on the windows receded, though it didn't disappear entirely, a perfect metaphor for the balance she was trying to achieve. You mean to leave us, Dr. Porter said quietly, and the grief in his voice nearly shattered her resolve. I mean to become worthy of your love, she answered, reaching out to touch his face with hands that no longer glowed with uncontrolled power, not by denying what I am, but by choosing how to be what I am. Salem cannot teach me that, but perhaps I can return someday and teach Salem. Through the window, she could see the crowd beginning to disperse, as if the supernatural tension that had drawn them was finally releasing its hold. Pastor Aldrich slumped against the wall, his certainties cracking like ice in spring thaw. The girl speaks wisdom beyond her years, Matthias said slowly, and for the first time since entering the room, he sounded uncertain. Very well, Evangeline Porter. We shall see what unprecedented thing you make of yourself. But Evangeline was already looking beyond all of them, toward a future she would write with her own transformed hands. The silence that followed stretched like a held breath, pregnant with possibilities none of them had anticipated. Evangeline felt the weight of her declaration settling into her bones, transforming from desperate proclamation into unshakable resolve. Outside, the dispersing crowd's footsteps crunched through snow with diminishing urgency, as if Salem itself was slowly exhaling after holding its breath too long. When will you go? Dr. Porter asked, his voice carefully steady despite the tears gathering in his eyes. "Tonight." The word emerged without hesitation, though saying it aloud sent a tremor of fear through her chest. "Every moment I remain puts you in danger, Papa. The townspeople may be leaving now, but their questions will return with the dawn. They'll want explanations for what they witnessed, and Salem has never been kind to those who harbor mysteries." Matthias moved to the window, his pale hands clasped behind his back as he observed the retreating torches. The girl shows wisdom. Fear postponed is merely fear multiplied. Salem's tolerance for the supernatural extends only as far as Sunday sermons allow. He turned back toward them, his ancient eyes reflecting centuries of similar departures. "Though I confess I had not anticipated traveling with such independent company." "Where will you take her?" The question came from Thomas Gideon, who had been silent since his wife's possessed descent to answer Matthias's summons. His face was haggard with the realization that Sarah's transformation was only beginning, that his own family now harbored secrets that would reshape their existence entirely. "I won't be taking her anywhere," Matthias replied with something that might have been amusement. "Miss Porter has made quite clear that she travels as an equal, not as claimed property. As to destination—" He paused, considering. "There are places where the boundaries between mortal and immortal worlds grow thin, places where one might learn to walk between them without losing oneself to either. The choice of where to begin that education, however, belongs to her." Evangeline felt the magnitude of that freedom settle over her like a mantle. For 17 years, every aspect of her existence had been determined by others: her father's medical concerns, Salem's social expectations, her body's rebellious episodes. Now, suddenly, she possessed not just power but agency to direct it. "I want to help others like us," she said, the words crystallizing as she spoke them. "Sarah won't be the last girl in Salem to experience awakening. There will be others, in other towns, other families torn apart by transformations they don't understand." She looked at Sarah, who had grown quiet and thoughtful on her bed. "You spoke of serving older masters. But what if we chose to serve something else entirely? What if we used our abilities to protect those caught between worlds instead of abandoning the human connections that shaped us?" Sarah's black eyes flickered with something almost like recognition. "You're proposing to become, what? Guardians?" "I'm proposing to become what we choose to become," Evangeline replied. "The power flowing through us doesn't dictate our purpose. We do." Pastor Aldrich straightened against the wall, his theological certainties crumbling but his essential nature, a man dedicated to protecting his flock, reasserting itself. If there are others experiencing what you've experienced, then perhaps Salem's understanding of good and evil has been too narrow." The admission seemed to cost him considerable effort. God's creation contains mysteries that our doctrines may not adequately address. Dr. Porter began gathering the scattered contents of his medical bag, his hands moving with the automatic precision of long practice. "You'll need supplies, warm clothing for travel, money for lodging." He paused, a leather journal half raised toward the bag. "I've documented every episode, every symptom, every treatment attempted. Perhaps this record could help others facing similar awakenings." The simple generosity of the gesture, her father offering his life's work to support a journey he neither understood nor approved of, nearly broke Evangeline's carefully maintained composure. She knelt beside him, covering his weathered hands with her own. "Keep the records, Papa. I have a feeling Salem will need a doctor who understands supernatural conditions, but I would take something else if you're willing to give it." She met his eyes, seeing love and loss warring in their depths. "Your blessing, not for what I am, but for what I'm trying to become." Dr. Porter's breath caught, and for a moment the small bedroom held only the sound of wind against frost-covered glass. Then he reached up to cup her face in his hands, his touch as gentle as when she was small and fevered. "You have it," he whispered. "You have always had it, my extraordinary daughter. Go and show the world what love looks like when it possesses the strength to protect itself." Outside, The last of the torchlight disappeared around distant corners, leaving Salem to contemplate the night's revelations in darkness. But inside the Gideon house, 3 young women who had never expected to see another sunrise were making plans that might reshape the very nature of the supernatural world. The plans took shape with startling swiftness, as if destiny itself were eager to see them realized. Evangeline moved through the Gideon house with newfound purpose, her supernatural senses cataloging every detail she would carry into memory. The scent of Sarah's mother's lavender sachets, the familiar creak of floorboards worn smooth by generations of feet, the way lamplight painted golden squares on walls that had sheltered Salem's secrets for decades. "There's a network," Matthias explained as they gathered around Thomas Gideon's writing desk, his pale fingers tracing invisible routes across a hand-drawn map of New England. Safe houses, sanctuaries, places where those caught between worlds can find refuge while they discover their true nature. But most who seek them out are fleeing in terror, desperate to hide from what they've become. His ancient eyes found Evangeline's. "You propose something far more ambitious, to transform these refuges into schools, these sanctuaries into centers of learning." Sarah stood at the window, her reflection ghostly against the frost-covered glass. "The awakened ones I've sensed in my dreams, they're scattered, isolated, convinced they're alone in their transformation." Her voice carried new resonance, as if speaking for multitudes rather than herself. "Most don't even survive the change. They either surrender entirely to the hunger or destroy themselves fighting it. Because they're offered only those 2 choices," Evangeline said firmly, folding warm woolen stockings into the traveling bag her father had provided. "Embrace monstrosity or die resisting it. But what if there were a third option? What if someone showed them how to honor both their human hearts and their supernatural strength?" The weight of such responsibility should have terrified her. Instead, Evangeline felt something like peace settling into her bones. The fainting spells, the years of weakness and confusion, they had been preparation for this moment, this choice to transform personal struggle into purposeful mission. "You'll need allies among the mortals," Pastor Aldrich said quietly from his position near the door. "Families like the Gideons, who've witnessed awakening firsthand and chosen love over fear. Doctors like your father, who understand that healing sometimes requires expanding one's definition of health." He paused, his weathered hands clasping and unclasping. "Ministers who can reconcile divine mystery with supernatural reality." Dr. Porter looked up from organizing medical supplies into a smaller traveling kit. The network could serve both directions, protecting the awakened from persecution while educating communities to recognize transformation as something other than demonic possession. His voice gained strength as the physician in him responded to the challenge. Prevention rather than mere treatment, understanding rather than exorcism. Evangeline felt tears prick her eyes at the sight of her father embracing a future that included rather than excluded her transformed nature. Salem won't be ready for such radical thinking immediately. "Salem has had its first taste tonight," Thomas Gideon observed, his arm protective around his wife's shoulders as she dozed fitfully in her chair. The town witnessed supernatural power that chose protection over destruction, love over vengeance. That memory will work on their fears like medicine on infection, slowly but inexorably. Matthias moved to stand beside Sarah at the window, 2 immortal figures silhouetted against the winter night. "The old ways are ending," he said, his voice carrying the weight of centuries. "For 1,000 years the awakened have lived in shadow, taking what they needed from mortal world while remaining forever apart from it. But you propose integration rather than predation, cooperation rather than dominance." He turned to study Evangeline with something approaching reverence. "You may succeed where older, more traditional powers have failed. Or we may fail spectacularly," Sarah added with dark honesty. "The forces that demand separation between mortal and immortal worlds won't welcome our interference. There will be consequences for choosing this path, enemies among both humans and supernatural beings who prefer the clarity of absolute division." "Then we'll face those consequences together," Evangeline replied, shouldering her traveling bag. The weight felt manageable, purposeful rather than burdensome, as allies rather than lone outcasts, as builders rather than destroyers. The clock on the mantel chimed midnight, its resonant note seeming to mark more than mere time. Outside, Salem slept uneasily, processing the night's revelations in dreams that would reshape its understanding of good and evil, human and monster, salvation and damnation. "The carriage I arrived in waits beyond the town borders," Matthias said, extending his arm toward Evangeline with courtly grace. "Our first destination lies 3 days north, where an old colleague maintains sanctuary for those fleeing supernatural persecution. From there, we begin building something unprecedented." Evangeline looked around the room one final time, memorizing the faces of those who had witnessed her transformation from victim to agent of change. Her father's proud tears, Pastor Aldrich's tentative hope, the Gideons' exhausted relief. All of it would travel with her into whatever future they were about to create. "Ready," she said, and meant it completely. The final confrontation with Salem's old fears and prejudices lay ahead, but she no longer approached it as someone seeking escape. She approached it as someone claiming her power to reshape the world itself. The night air cut like a blade against Evangeline's face as they stepped beyond the Gideon threshold, but the cold no longer touched her with the same mortal vulnerability. Each breath crystallized in silver clouds that dissipated into darkness, marking their passage toward whatever destiny awaited beyond Salem's sleeping borders. Behind them, the town lay shrouded in deceptive peace, its windows dark save for the occasional flicker of candlelight where restless souls processed the evening's impossible revelations. They had traveled perhaps half a mile when the first sign of opposition materialized from the shadows between snow-laden pines. Figures emerged from concealment with supernatural silence. 3 forms that moved with predatory grace, their eyes reflecting starlight like polished obsidian. Matthias halted so abruptly that Evangeline nearly collided with his rigid back. "Marcus," Matthias said, his voice carrying centuries of complicated history. "I wondered when you would reveal yourself." The center figure stepped forward, and Evangeline's enhanced senses immediately catalogued the threat he represented. Tall and lean with aristocratic features carved from marble, he possessed the same ageless quality as Matthias, but none of his restraint. Power radiated from him like heat from forge fire, wild and predatory, and utterly without mercy. "Brother," Marcus replied, the word dripping with mockery and ancient resentment. "Still playing protector to mortal strays, I see, though this one—" His gaze fixed on Evangeline with hungry interest. "This one carries considerably more potential than your usual lost lambs." The 2 companions flanking him moved with coordinated precision, positioning themselves to block any retreat toward Salem. Both women, both radiating the controlled violence of apex predators who had never learned to doubt their supremacy. Evangeline felt her own power responding to their proximity, rising like a tide that threatened to sweep away everything she had just discovered about balance and choice. "She comes with me willingly," Matthias said carefully. "There is no claim to contest here." "Isn't there?" Marcus circled them with fluid grace, his attention never leaving Evangeline's face. "A Dhampir awakening, the first in 3 centuries, and you propose to waste her potential on your pathetic experiments with mortal sympathy." His laughter rang like breaking glass across the frozen landscape. "She belongs with her true kind, learning to embrace power without the weakness of human sentiment." Evangeline felt the weight of everything she had just committed to. The network of sanctuaries, the promise to help others navigate their transformations, the delicate balance between human compassion and supernatural strength. This was the test she had not anticipated, the moment when theory would collide with brutal reality. "I belong to no one," she said, stepping forward despite Matthias's protective gesture. "And I certainly don't belong to someone who speaks of human emotion as weakness." Marcus stopped circling, his perfect features arranging themselves into an expression of amused condescension. "Child, you understand nothing of what you are. The power flowing through your veins comes with responsibilities that transcend mortal attachments. You are meant to be a bridge, yes, but a bridge that elevates humanity toward immortal perfection, not one that drags immortals down into human limitation. And what does your version of perfection look like? Evangeline challenged, though every instinct screamed warnings about provoking something so clearly dangerous. Predators ruling over prey, the strong taking whatever they desire from the weak. Clarity, Marcus replied, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried perfect clarity across the snow-muffled landscape. No more hiding in shadows, no more pretending that mortal and immortal natures can coexist peacefully. You could lead our kind into open dominance, could show mortals their proper place in the natural hierarchy. One of his companions moved closer, her pale lips curving in a smile that promised exquisite cruelty. The awakening has only begun, little Dampere. Soon the power will demand choices you cannot avoid. Better to embrace your true nature now than be torn apart later by impossible contradictions. Evangeline felt the truth in those words like a physical blow. The balance she had achieved in the Gideon house already felt fragile, threatened by the mere proximity of beings who radiated such absolute certainty. Her power responded to theirs like metal to lodestone, eager to test itself against their ancient strength. But beneath that supernatural pull, something deeper held firm, the memory of her father's blessing, of Sarah as tentative hope, of Pastor Aldrich choosing expansion over restriction despite a lifetime of rigid doctrine. Those connections anchored her when raw power would have swept her toward easier, more destructive choices. "You're right about one thing," she said, her voice gaining strength even as her body trembled with barely contained energy. "The awakening has only begun, but not in the direction you imagine." The winter wind stilled around them, as if the very air were holding its breath. In that suspended moment, Evangeline understood that everything, her future, the fate of others caught between worlds, the possibility of peace between mortal and immortal realms, balanced on what she chose to do next. The final test had begun. The silence shattered as Marcus moved with inhuman speed, closing the distance between them in a heartbeat. But Evangeline was no longer the trembling girl who had collapsed in Salem's churchyard. Her awakened senses tracked his approach with crystalline clarity, and power surged through her veins like liquid fire. She met his charge not with retreat, but with her own supernatural grace, their collision sending shockwaves through the frozen ground. Snow exploded around them in glittering clouds as they grappled, his centuries of experience matched against her raw, untested strength. His fingers closed around her throat with crushing force, but she drove her elbow upward, connecting with his jaw hard enough to snap his head back. "Impressive," he hissed, blood staining his perfect lips. "But strength without purpose is merely another form of weakness." His companions moved to flank her, but Matthias intercepted them with deadly efficiency. The clearing erupted into violence as immortal fought immortal, their battles carving gouges in the earth and splintering ancient trees. Evangeline caught glimpses of the melee, Matthias's coat streaming behind him as he deflected claws that could shred steel, Sarah materializing from nowhere to drive one attacker back with surprising ferocity. But Marcus commanded her full attention, his assault relentless and precise. Each blow he landed sent jarring pain through her awakened body, while his words cut deeper than physical wounds. "Look around you, child," he snarled, catching her wrist and twisting until she cried out. "Your precious friends already embrace their true nature when survival demands it. How long before necessity strips away their noble intentions entirely?" He was right. She could see it in the way Matthias's careful restraint cracked under pressure, revealing glimpses of the ancient predator beneath his protective facade. Sarah fought with desperate savagery, her gentle humanity submerged beneath supernatural hunger for victory. The violence called to something primal in Evangeline's own nature, urging her to abandon thought for pure, destructive instinct. "This is what you truly are," Marcus whispered, his breath cold against her ear as he forced her to her knees. "Power that takes what it needs. Strength that bows to no mortal weakness. Stop fighting yourself and embrace. No, The word tore from Evangeline's throat with such force that frost flowers bloomed across the ground around them. This is what you chose to become. I choose something else. She reached not for the raw power that screamed for release, but for the deeper strength she had discovered in the Gideon house, the ability to hold multiple truths simultaneously without being destroyed by their contradictions. Yes, she was capable of terrible violence, but she was also capable of healing touch. Yes, she possessed supernatural strength, but she could choose to use it in service of protection rather than domination. The realization flooded through her like dawn breaking, and with it came power unlike anything she had experienced. Not the wild, destructive force that Marcus represented, but something more complex and infinitely more dangerous, strength tempered by compassion, supernatural ability guided by human conscience. Marcus sensed the change immediately, his grip loosening in surprise as energy poured off her in waves. "Impossible," he breathed. "No one can maintain such balance. The contradictions will tear you apart." "Maybe," Evangeline agreed, rising to her feet as power continued building around her like a storm given form. "But I'd rather be torn apart trying to bridge two worlds than whole while destroying both of them." She struck him with the full force of her integrated nature, not pure vampire strength or Dhampir rage, but something that transcended both. The blow sent him flying backward to crash against a massive pine, the impact shaking snow from branches 20 feet above. The other battles ceased as if a spell had broken. Marcus's companions stared in shock at their leader's crumpled form, while Matthias and Sarah moved to flank Evangeline with protective intent. The clearing fell silent except for the whisper of falling snow and Marcus's labored breathing. He struggled to his feet, his perfect features now marred by surprise and something that might have been respect. "This isn't over, Dhampir," he said, gesturing for his companions to retreat. "The old ways have momentum that your idealism cannot match. Others will come who won't be so easily impressed by your parlor tricks. Then I'll face them too," Evangeline replied steadily. "As many times as necessary, in whatever form they take." Marcus smiled, a cold, calculating expression that promised future pain. "We shall see how long your noble intentions survive the realities of immortal existence. Power has its own logic, child. Eventually you'll understand that mercy is simply another word for weakness." They vanished into the forest with inhuman speed, leaving only disturbed snow and the scent of spilled blood to mark their presence. Evangeline swayed on her feet as the supernatural energy that had sustained her began to ebb, but Matthias's steadying hand found her shoulder. "The first test," he said quietly, "but certainly not the last." Evangeline nodded, understanding that this confrontation had been declaration as much as battle, a statement that the old ways would not yield without a fight. But she had proven something to herself in these frozen moments. Her power need not corrupt her purpose, and her humanity need not limit her strength. The real work was just beginning. The tremors began as they resumed their journey through the snow-laden forest, subtle at first, a slight weakness in Evangeline's knees, a flutter of exhaustion that she attributed to the aftermath of battle. But with each step toward the waiting carriage, the sensations intensified, until she found herself gripping Matthias's arm for support that had nothing to do with treacherous footing. "The integration is unstable," Sarah observed with clinical precision, her enhanced senses cataloging symptoms that mortal perception would miss. "Drawing on both natures simultaneously, it's burning through your system like fever." Evangeline tried to deny the growing weakness, but her body betrayed her with another violent tremor that nearly sent her to her knees. The power she had wielded against Marcus felt like borrowed fire now, its absence leaving her hollow and aching. "I don't understand." The balance felt so natural, so right. "Because it was," Matthias said quietly, though his voice carried undertones of ancient grief. "You achieved something unprecedented, true synthesis between human and vampire nature. But the cost—" He paused, studying her with eyes that had witnessed countless supernatural transformations. "The cost may be higher than any of us anticipated." They reached the carriage as the first wave of real pain struck, doubling Evangeline over with its intensity. Through gritted teeth, she managed to speak. "What's happening to me?" Sarah's expression had gone carefully neutral, the look of a healer preparing to deliver devastating news. "Your human physiology can't sustain the level of integration you achieved. The mortal systems that anchor your compassion, your conscience, your ability to choose mercy over power, they're being consumed by supernatural energy." The words hit Evangeline like physical blows. "You're saying I have to choose? Become fully vampire or lose the integration entirely," Matthias finished, his centuries of composure cracking to reveal raw anguish. "Revert to purely human nature and forfeit the power that makes you capable of bridging two worlds." Evangeline sank onto the carriage steps as understanding crashed over her. The synthesis she had achieved, the perfect balance between human heart and supernatural strength that had allowed her to defeat Marcus without becoming him, it was killing the very humanity that made it meaningful. "How long?" she whispered. "Hours," Sarah replied with professional honesty. "Perhaps less." The deterioration accelerates with each use of integrated power. The forest around them seemed to mock her revelation with its pristine beauty, snow falling in gentle patterns that would outlast any mortal struggle. Somewhere in Salem's sleeping streets lay families like the Gideons, people who needed exactly the kind of bridge she had promised to become. Beyond Salem waited countless others caught between worlds, awakening Dampiers who would face the same impossible choice between power and humanity. "There must be another way," Evangeline said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Some method of stabilizing the integration, some compromise that—" "No." The word fell from Matthias's lips like a stone into still water. "I've searched for such solutions across centuries, watched others attempt similar synthesis. The contradictions are fundamental, written into the very nature of what we are." Evangeline closed her eyes, feeling the weight of sacrifice settling around her like a shroud. She could choose to preserve her humanity, return to Salem as the physician's daughter with mysterious episodes that proper medicine might eventually control. Live a normal life, marry someone suitable, bear children who would never know their mother had briefly touched the divine. Or she could embrace the transformation fully, become the bridge between worlds that others desperately needed, but forfeit the human compassion that would make her service meaningful rather than tyrannical. "Marcus was right about one thing," she said finally, opening her eyes to meet Matthias's ancient gaze. "Power does have its own logic, but he was wrong about what that logic demands." She stood slowly, fighting through waves of weakness that threatened to topple her. The choice crystallized with painful clarity. She could save herself or save the possibility of peace between mortal and immortal realms, but not both. "If I choose full transformation," she asked quietly, "if I sacrifice my human nature completely, will I become like him? Will I lose the ability to choose mercy over power?" Sarah and Matthias exchanged a look heavy with unspoken knowledge. "Not immediately," Sarah said carefully, "but without human conscience to anchor you, without mortal attachments to remind you of vulnerability and grace." She left the sentence unfinished. Evangeline nodded, understanding flooding through her like ice water. The integration that had felt like triumph was impossible to sustain, but its brief existence had shown her something precious, the potential for supernatural beings to choose protection over predation, service over dominance. Even if she could not maintain that balance herself, she could create the conditions for others to attempt it, even if the price was everything she had hoped to preserve. The carriage waited in patient silence, ready to carry her toward whatever future she chose to claim. Behind her, Salem slept unaware that its strange daughter was about to make a sacrifice that would echo across centuries. The real work was just beginning, but it would cost her everything she had been. Evangeline placed her trembling hand on the carriage door, feeling the polished wood beneath her palm like an anchor to the world she was about to leave behind. The decision crystallized in the space between one heartbeat and the next, not the choice she had wanted to make, but the only one that could honor what she had glimpsed in those precious moments of perfect integration. "I'll take the transformation," she said, her voice steady despite the weakness coursing through her limbs. "But not for power. For service." Matthias's expression shifted through a dozen emotions: grief, pride, something that might have been relief warring with regret. "Are you certain? Once begun, this path cannot be undone. The Evangeline Porter who collapsed in Salem's churchyard will cease to exist." "She already has." The words emerged with surprising clarity, carrying truth that resonated in her bones. That girl believed she was broken, diseased, abandoned by God. I know better now. I understand what I was becoming, and what I must become fully if others are to have any hope. Sarah stepped closer, her healer's instincts evident in every line of her posture. "The physical transition will be significant. Your human vulnerabilities will burn away, but so will certain capacities for emotional connection. You'll remember love, compassion, mercy, but you may not feel them the same way." "Then I'll have to choose them deliberately," Evangeline replied, meeting Sarah's concerned gaze. "Make conscious decisions to honor what I'll no longer feel instinctively. If Marcus taught us anything, it's that our nature doesn't have to dictate our choices." The irony wasn't lost on any of them, that her final human act would be choosing to transcend humanity itself. But as another wave of deterioration swept through her, Evangeline understood that this wasn't truly an ending. It was metamorphosis, terrible and necessary. Matthias moved with ceremonial precision, producing a small silver blade that caught moonlight like captured starfire. "The old rites," he explained, "require conscious participation from both parties, your blood freely given, mixed with mine, while you maintain clear intent about what you're choosing and why." Evangeline extended her hand without hesitation, watching as he drew the blade across her palm in a line that barely stung. Her blood welled dark and rich, carrying scents that spoke of mortality's fleeting sweetness. When he made a matching cut on his own palm, the difference was immediate. His blood held depths that seemed to swallow light, ancient power made manifest. Their hands joined, warm and cold intertwining as two different kinds of life force merged. The sensation began as gentle warmth, then built to burning intensity that raced through her veins like liquid lightning. Evangeline felt her human systems responding one final time, heart hammering against her ribs as if trying to escape what was coming. "Focus on your purpose," Matthias murmured, his voice distant through the rushing in her ears. "Hold tight to the reasons, the people you mean to serve. Let those anchors guide what you become." She thought of the Gideon children, faces bright with tentative hope, as they learned their daughter might not be lost to darkness. Of Pastor Aldrich choosing expansion over limitation despite generations of rigid doctrine. Of her father's blessing, freely given, even when he couldn't fully understand what he was blessing. The transformation accelerated, mortality burning away like morning mist before the sun. Her heartbeat began to slow, each pulse more deliberate than the last, until silence settled where the frantic rhythm of human life had been. Her senses exploded outward. Suddenly she could hear Sarah's careful breathing, smell the complex mineral signature of snow that had fallen through different atmospheric layers, see individual ice crystals forming on nearby branches with perfect clarity. But beneath the overwhelming flood of supernatural awareness, something else was happening. The human warmth that had defined her emotional landscape was dimming, becoming memory rather than immediate experience. She could recall the feeling of her father's embrace, but the sensation felt distant now, like studying a painting of fire rather than standing before actual flames. "The final stage," Sarah whispered, though her voice carried clearly to Evangeline's enhanced hearing. "How do you feel?" Evangeline considered the question with new precision, analyzing her internal state with capabilities that surpassed mere human introspection. Different, stronger, but still, myself, I think. Changed rather than replaced. She released Matthias's hand and stood, marveling at the way her body moved with fluid grace, no longer subject to mortal limitations. The weakness that had threatened to destroy her was gone, replaced by strength that felt infinite and carefully controlled. "The network we discussed," she said, testing her voice and finding it clearer than it had ever been. "Sanctuaries for those caught between worlds. We begin immediately." Matthias nodded, something like wonder in his ancient features. "You remember. You choose to continue despite having the power to choose otherwise," Evangeline finished. "That's exactly why it matters." The girl who had fainted in Salem's churchyard was gone, but what remained carried her purpose forward, transformed but unbroken. The real work could finally begin. 2 months had passed since the transformation, and now Evangeline stood at the edge of Salem's town square, watching morning light paint the familiar streets in shades of gold and amber that her enhanced vision rendered with crystalline precision. She had spent the interim traveling to distant sanctuaries with Matthias and Sarah, learning to navigate her new nature while establishing networks of protection for awakening Dampiers. But Salem called to her, not as the broken girl who had fled, but as the bridge builder she had chosen to become. The first test of her return came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Henderson, the baker's wife who had always treated Evangeline with distant politeness, approached across the square with determined steps. Where the old Evangeline might have felt nervous anticipation, this new version simply observed with calm interest, cataloguing the woman's elevated heart rate and the complex mixture of fear and curiosity radiating from her. "Miss Porter," Mrs. Henderson said, stopping at what she clearly considered a safe distance. "You look, well, different." "I am different," Evangeline replied simply, making no effort to soften the truth. Her voice carried undertones now that seemed to resonate in listeners' bones, compelling honesty. "But I'm still the physician's daughter who grew up on Chestnut Street." Mrs. Henderson's hands twisted in her apron. "The things people are saying, about where you've been, what you've become, some call it witchcraft. Others say you've been blessed. Pastor Aldrich speaks of divine mystery, but the older folks remember the old fears." Evangeline felt a familiar stirring where her heart had once beaten. Not the automatic warmth of human sympathy, but a conscious choice to offer comfort, despite her transformed nature. This was the test she had been preparing for, whether she could serve humanity while no longer fully belonging to it. "What do you think, Mrs. Henderson?" she asked gently. The woman studied her with the careful attention of someone examining a beautiful but potentially dangerous creature. "I think you helped my nephew Thomas when his strange episode started last month. Word travels fast in small towns. They say you knew exactly what was happening to him, knew how to help when the doctor couldn't." The case had been delicate. A 15-year-old boy experiencing the early stages of Dampier awakening, his family terrified by supernatural manifestations they couldn't understand. Evangeline had arrived in time to guide the transition, preventing the violent self-destruction that claimed so many untrained half-vampires. Thomas needed understanding, not exorcism, Evangeline said. He needed to learn that being different doesn't mean being damned. "And is that what you learned?" The question carried weight beyond casual curiosity. Evangeline considered her response with the careful precision that now defined her thought processes. She could sense other townspeople drawing closer, conversations halting as neighbors strained to overhear. Salem was testing her through Mrs. Henderson's inquiry, determining whether their strange daughter had returned as protector or predator. "I learned that salvation sometimes requires sacrifice," she said finally. "That serving others matters more than serving ourselves. That love can survive transformation if we choose to honor it." Movement across the square caught her supernatural perception. Her father, emerging from his medical practice, moving toward them with the careful gait of a man approaching something precious and potentially fragile. The sight of him triggered memories that felt both immediate and distant, emotional echoes of the daughter she had been. "Papa," she said softly, as he reached them, noting how his familiar scent had changed to her enhanced senses, carrying new notes of worry and wonder intertwined. Dr. Porter's examination of her was thorough and professional, but his eyes held depths of paternal love that made Evangeline's conscious choice toward compassion feel easier to maintain. "You seem healthy, strong." He paused, searching for words. "At peace in ways you never were before." "The illness is gone," she confirmed. "What I suffered wasn't disease. It was incomplete transformation. I've finished the process now, And the cost? His physician's training demanded honest assessment. Evangeline felt the truth of her answer in ways her human self never could have, not as emotion but as analyzed certainty. Everything I was, and everything I might have been. She paused, then added more softly, but not everything I chose to become. Mrs. Henderson had been listening with the focused attention of someone witnessing history unfold. Now she stepped closer, her fear gradually giving way to something approaching acceptance. The network Pastor Aldrich mentioned, sanctuaries for children like Thomas. You're really going to build that? We've already begun. Evangeline gestured toward the tree line where Matthias waited with patient stillness. Salem will be our first permanent refuge, a place where families can bring their transforming children without fear, where awakening Dampiers can learn balance instead of discovering destruction. The small crowd that had gathered murmured among themselves, Salem's collective consciousness, processing the reality of supernatural protection, offered freely rather than supernatural threat to be feared. Dr. Porter reached out tentatively, then embraced his transformed daughter with the same fierce love he had shown the morning she left. The physical sensation felt different to Evangeline now, analyzed rather than felt, but her conscious choice to return that love burned steady as any heartbeat. She was home, changed beyond recognition but unchanged in purpose. The real work could finally begin in earnest. 6 months later, Evangeline stood in what had once been the abandoned Thornfield estate on Salem's outskirts, watching as workers put finishing touches on the sanctuary's first dormitory. The November air carried scents of fresh lumber and winter's approach, but to her enhanced senses, it also held something more precious, the absence of fear. Through the tall windows, she could see children playing in the courtyard, Thomas Henderson among them, no longer ashamed of his supernatural strength, teaching younger ones how to control their emerging abilities. Sarah moved between them with practiced ease, her medical training now focused on the unique challenges of Dampier physiology. Even Pastor Aldrich had become a regular visitor, his theological perspectives expanding to accommodate divine mystery, in forms his predecessors never imagined. The third dormitory will be completed before Christmas, Matthias reported, appearing at her side with the silent grace that had once seemed ominous but now felt companionable. Word is spreading through the northern territories. Families are bringing their children from as far as the Canadian provinces. Evangeline nodded, processing the information with the methodical precision that had replaced human intuition. Each arriving family represented both triumph and responsibility, lives saved from the destruction that awaited untrained Dampiers, but also souls requiring careful guidance through transformations that would forever separate them from purely human existence. Any word from the European covens? She asked. Cautious interest, Matthias replied diplomatically. Your approach challenges centuries of established practice. Some view integration with human communities as dangerous exposure, others see it as evolution. The political implications were complex, but Evangeline had learned to navigate supernatural diplomacy with the same careful balance she brought to all aspects of her transformed existence. Where her human heart might once have felt frustration at ancient prejudices, she now experienced calculated determination to prove alternative approaches through demonstrable success. A commotion in the courtyard drew her attention. 2 of the younger children, siblings whose Dampier awakening had manifested simultaneously, were arguing over a wooden toy with supernatural intensity that threatened to escalate beyond childish disagreement. Before Sarah could intervene, Evangeline moved through the space between heartbeats, appearing beside them with gentle authority. Emma, Jacob, she said quietly, her voice carrying undertones that naturally commanded attention without inspiring fear. What would your parents think if they saw you using enhanced strength against each other? The children immediately released their grip on the disputed toy, shame and affection warring in their expressions. Emma, barely 8, but already possessed of speed that would shame adult vampires, looked up at Evangeline with worship that made conscious compassion easier to access. We forgot, Jacob mumbled. It doesn't feel different anymore. That's exactly when it becomes most dangerous, Evangeline replied, kneeling to their level despite having no physical need to do so. The gesture was calculated theater, but theater in service of genuine care. Power that feels natural is power we stop questioning, and power without questions becomes tyranny. She had learned this lesson through careful observation of her own transformation. The absence of automatic human emotion required constant conscious choice toward virtue, but that very consciousness had unexpected benefits. Unlike the Dampiers who gained power through violent awakening, those trained in deliberate compassion developed sophisticated ethical frameworks that served them across centuries. "Will we ever feel normal again?" Emma asked with devastating directness. The question hung in the winter air like visible breath, carrying weight that exceeded its simple words. Through the windows, Evangeline could see other children pausing their activities to listen, each one grappling with similar concerns about identity and belonging. "You'll feel different," Evangeline answered honestly. "But different doesn't mean broken. Different can mean blessed if you choose to use your gifts in service of others." Thomas Henderson approached from across the courtyard, his transformation now 6 months advanced and stabilized under careful guidance. "Miss Porter helped me understand something important," he said, addressing the younger children with the gravity of earned experience. "We don't become monsters unless we choose to be monsters. Every day, we get to decide what kind of different we want to be." Watching him mentor others, Evangeline felt something that might once have been maternal pride, but now manifested as deep satisfaction with strategic success. Each child who learned healthy integration became a teacher for the next, creating sustainable networks of support that could survive individual loss. The afternoon light was fading, painting the sanctuary in shades of amber and gold that reminded her powerfully of Salem's town square on the morning she had revealed her transformation to neighbors who chose acceptance over fear. Through conscious effort, she accessed the emotional resonance of that memory, not feeling it as humans felt, but choosing to honor its importance. Dr. Porter's carriage appeared on the tree-lined drive, right on schedule for his weekly visits. He had become the sanctuary's official physician, his medical practice expanding to serve both human and Dampier needs with equal dedication. In his passenger seat, Evangeline could make out Mrs. Henderson, now one of the sanctuary's most vocal advocates in Salem proper. This was the new normal she had built from the ashes of her human life, a place where transformation meant growth rather than loss, where supernatural gifts served community rather than individual power. The girl who had collapsed in Salem's churchyard was gone, but what remained had found ways to honor her memory through chosen service.